In history, there are heroes and villains. What makes someone a hero? Maybe they helped make the world a fairer place, or they stood up when somebody was being hurt. Heroes inspire us. We love to root for them. We want to be like them. What makes someone a villain? Sometimes it was because they were violent, or they were mean, or ruthless. Unfortunately, history is full of famous villains. But sometimes it isn't that simple. A lot of the people you're about in history books are both. Most people aren't entirely good or entirely bad. Napoleon Bonaparte is a perfect example. Napoleon is a very famous person from history. Many people would call him infamous. Infamous people are usually remembered for being a villain. But that's not really fair. Napoleon's life is a lot more complex than that. Sure, he did some terrible things, but he did some heroic things too. In fact, he spent his whole life constantly jumping back and forth over the line that defines heroes and villains. History has pretty much decided Napoleon was a villain. But how about you? How will you judge him? Napoleon Bonaparte was born about 250 years ago in 1769 on an island called Corsica in Europe. When he was born, the island was ruled by the King of France. This meant that Napoleon was born French. He left home to attend schools in France. This helped him learn to speak French. It also meant he could go to the best military schools. He must have done very well too, because he became an officer in the French army when he was only 16 years old. There was a lot going on in France at this time. In 1789, there was a big revolution. French people didn't like their king. He was living an extravagant life filled with food, wine, and gold while they were starving in the dirty streets. Most people were angry that he wasn't taking care of them like someone in charge should do, so they overthrew him. Napoleon wasn't in France while this was happening. He was taking a break from his career in the military and living back home in Corsica, but he was still paying attention. He listened to all of the political discussions going on around him. He started to agree with those who hated the king. He adopted their radical revolutionary ideals. Eventually, Napoleon returned to Paris, which was the center of the French government. The new leader of France, Maximilien Robespierre, needed Napoleon's clever mind to lead his troops. You see, while France had been busy the past few years with their king, other countries saw this as an opportunity to invade. Under its new leader, France needed to prove the world that they were strong, that they were not a country to mess with. Napoleon was just the guy to send that message. Robespierre put Napoleon in charge of protecting France and its people from invasions, but there was a slight problem. The French army wasn't in the best shape. In fact, it was pretty pathetic, but Napoleon wasn't worried. He knew he could lead them to victory, and he did. Not only did he defend France, he expanded it. In 1793, while he was fighting different battles around Europe, Napoleon was promoted 3 ranks in the French army within 4 months. He was proving to be a fierce leader. He was winning impressive battles. He became famous for his military tactics. Robespierre, the leader of France at the time, made sure everyone knew how much he appreciated Napoleon. He was fast becoming a hero to France. However, while Napoleon was away fighting wars with other countries, things weren't going so great back home in France. Robespierre was turning out to be even worse than the king he'd replaced. He created some strict laws, and anyone who broke them was publicly executed. It was horrible. Overall, more than 17,000 French people lost their lives during this short period of rule. In fact, his rule from September 1793 to July 1794 was named the Reign of Terror because people were pretty much terrified of him. So history is pretty clear with this one. Robespierre was definitely more of a villain. But the French had just ditched a king that had been a lousy ruler. They knew what had to be done and how to do it. So they overthrew Robespierre too. This was great for the French people, but not so great for Napoleon. He had done all that work, building strong troops, winning tough battles, and planning attacks. Unfortunately, he had done it all for Robespierre, and the whole country was not very happy with him. Napoleon was now labelled as a villain too, and he was put on house arrest. After about a year of being stuck at home, Napoleon was freed. Now, he needed to earn back the trust of the new people in charge of France. Another new government was being set up in Paris. This time, they wanted a group of people in charge and a constitution like the one in the United States. This would be a set of fair rules and laws to keep all French people safe. France feared him. Then he made one really bad decision. He decided to invade Russia during the winter. His army was prepared for battle, but they were not so prepared for freezing cold temperatures. Many of them starved to death in the cold even before they met the enemy. Eventually, Napoleon and his army were outsmarted by the Russians, who were much more prepared for their own winter storms than he was. With no food, no supplies, and a depleting amount of men, Napoleon was forced to return home. He lost many of his loyal men to the Russian winter. That wasn't such a popular thing back home in France. There was nobody left to defend him within his own country, and the world outside of France already considered him a villain. Those countries saw this as their chance to take him down once and for all. They invaded France. Napoleon had no army left. He was helpless to defend himself. Napoleon's enemies exiled him to a tiny island called Elba. Instead of an empire, now all Napoleon had was a small island. Of course, this wasn't enough for him. About a year into his exile, Napoleon decided he would once again try to get back on the hero list. He escaped the island and sailed back to France with some of his supporters he still had. He marched into Paris. Crowds lined the streets, cheering to welcome him back. They missed his great success as Emperor of France. Maybe he could still be a hero. Napoleon easily took back control of the country and started building a new army. Though this time his enemies were prepared, they had all teamed up against him. Napoleon's great return to France only lasted 100 days before he was once again defeated by his enemies and placed back in exile. He was exiled to a British-controlled island much further away, so they could make sure he wouldn't escape anymore. This time, Napoleon stayed in exile. He died only 6 years later, at age 51. Napoleon did quite a lot in his short life. He was a general, a commander, a dictator, an emperor, a hero, and a villain. Next time you're learning about all the people from history, think of Napoleon. Think of the different things that he did. Think about how a French person would have written about him, and how one of his enemies would have written about him. Depending on who's telling it, the story of a person can change a lot. So what do you think, was Napoleon a hero or a villain? Or maybe he was both. Either way, there's a lot we can learn from him. He saw the value of public education. He advocated at times for a fair government, but maybe the most important lesson: never invade Russia during the winter. We hope you enjoyed this episode about Napoleon Bonaparte.